everybody, and welcome to Gen Friends. I'm your host, Sherry Hudson Passy from Carolina Girl Genealogy. And we have got, as usual, a great panel and a great special guest. So I'll start with the introductions with Melissa Barker, aka the Archive Lady. Hi, Melissa.
Hello, and my blog is A Genealogist in the Archives. It's a mouthful.
But it's a good blog. And we've got, I'm going to start getting Lara and Laura. I'm going to call you guys the wrong name. We've got Laura Hedgecock. Hey, Laura.
Hi.
From Treasure Chest of Memories. We're glad that you're here. Hello. We've
Hi.
got Mr. Dan Earl.
Hello.
Giving us some YDNA on the panel tonight. And what is he? Oh, he's back up to, he keeps changing his name, people, so you never know who he really is. So he's our family. We have Mary Kircher Roddy from MKR Genealogy, too. Hi, Mary.
Hi.
So
great to be here.
Good to have you. And our special guest tonight is Lara Diamond. We're so glad that you're here, Lara.
Thanks for having me.
And Lara is going to talk to us about Jewish genealogy. Now, if you don't know Lara, and you should, she writes and she speaks on Jewish genealogy, and her blog is I'll say it wrong. It's genealogy, right?
Yes, genealogy.
There's genealogy, which is that's a great play on words. So you have a wonderful blog, and I know you speak everywhere. You're always busy, except for during
now
COVID-19. Nobody's speaking anywhere. But thank you so much for coming and talking to us about. I asked you to come on and talk to us a little bit about Holocaust Remembrance Day too, which we've just had recently. So. To get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in genealogy?
So I got started when I was probably about 12. I read Roots by Alex Haley, and I said, if he can do this, I can do this.
Yeah.
And my poor mother, because I didn't have a driver's license, drove me we went down to National Archives in DC. They tried to help her, and she's like, no, I brought my book to read in the corner. You need to help this little twerp over here. And so I learned how to use microfilm machines, and I spent hours finding census records and immigration documents that now I can find in 30 seconds on Ancestry.
Exactly.
Yep, she drove me to the local family history center, and she couldn't care less about things that I find now, but she was very supportive of my interest.
Oh, well, that's great. Now, I've got one more question, and then I'm gonna let the panel at you. Okay, so genealogy is genealogy, and we've got all sorts of different, types of genealogy. What is different about Jewish genealogy? I mean, you're gonna have the same basic steps, but there's some twists and turns that you've got to take to work on those records, right?
Yep. So you're breaking up a little bit, but
okay.
With Jewish genealogy, it really depends where people are from in Europe. But in general, a lot of Jews haven't had surnames for very long. Records can be in multiple different languages, depending on border changes. Many times, Jewish records were kept separately from other records. People tended to change names when they came to America, not only the surnames, but also given names. And in DNA, because Jews are endogamous, which means that it's a small enclosed population whose descendants all married one another over and over and over again for generations, we're all connected in multiple ways. And so the commercial DNA companies, when they predict a relationship, they tend to be predicting much more close relationships than actually are the case. And so it makes it a lot more challenging, but it's also a lot more fun because, who wants it all to be really easy?
Well, exactly.
Except for Laura.
Laura wants it to be. Laura, do you want it to be easy, or were you raising your hand to ask a question? Or both?
I want it to be easy.
I'll show you my DNA one day, Laura. And
that was going to be my thing. If you look at her DNA matches, you have like 1,000 first cousins or something. It's like ridiculous.
Not first cousins, but once you get to like fourth cousins or closer in Ancestry, I think it's something like 90,000.
Oh, yeah, and you look at me. I'm so happy if I get a fourth cousin. I mean, because
you can have some of mine. We'll just share.
And that's due to the endogamy, right?
It's due to endogamy, and they're not all true fourth cousins,
right.
And so you have to use some different techniques to really figure out which of those fourth cousins are worth pursuing. Or you're going to spend your whole life going down rabbit holes of cousins that
Right.
aren't going to be traceable in genealogical time because of how far back the records might go.
Now I know that
And
you
I
guys.
think we should also point out that she's very, very smart. I mean, it's not like all of us can sit. She has a mathematical brain. She is a mathematician.
Right.
So she's really good at teasing those things apart. Sorry, I have to brag on you because you didn't
And
do
I
a
hang out with
sufficient job
Laura
of
just to
bragging
have
on
my
yourself.
I get my ego stroked when I'm around Laura, so it works out nicely. And she supplies me with potato chips.
Well, and I know that you write about all these things on your blog too, so
I
people
do.
can go to your blog and they can get some help on how to work through
Exactly.
these issues. Yeah, and I've read a lot of your blog posts, and you do it in a way that makes people can understand. I don't have any Jewish genealogy, but I'm intrigued, and so I'll see one of your blog posts, and I'll go, I've got to look at that and see what she's doing, and it's amazing. It's amazing. So, and a lot of it is sad too. A lot of it is very sad. We talked about Holocaust Remembrance Day, and you just recently found was it 15 more people?
Yeah, I just this past weekend I posted every year on Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah, I post a list of all of the relatives that I found who were murdered in the Holocaust, and basically their names, their ages, and if they're an addition that I found since the last year. And I added, I don't remember the number, but like 80 something since the previous year. This week I was indexing records for a town where it was in the general vicinity of where my family lived, but I didn't expect to find my relatives there. I found a branch that I had the birth record for the father, and then he kind of disappeared. Well, he disappeared because he moved to this other town, got married there, and had a whole family there. And I traced them forward, and all of them were killed in spring of 1944. So found 15 new cousins, and I have 15 new cousins to add to the list. And so,
Oh,
it's kind of sad, but it's also this is a way that somebody can remember them, because
mhm.
nobody remembered these people existed. And
Right.
now that we can finally see that they did and at least
Right.
remember them. And I publish their name every year now.
Yeah, it's a kind of a bittersweet thing. It's got to be so hard to find their names and then trace them and realize they were murdered. But
It
at
is.
least, you're putting their names out there again, and they are being remembered. So,
I always have that when I'm
oh,
indexing birth records. I'm doing a lot of birth records now from the late 30s and early 40s.
mhm.
Like, I don't want to know what happens to all these kids, but this might be the only
Yes,
record that they existed. So
exactly,
Oh,
exactly.
wow.
All right, anybody else got some questions for Lara?
I do. I do not have any Jewish ancestry, but I also know that I can learn, like Laura said, from others,
Mhm.
even in a realm that I'm not doing research. So one of the things that I am very adamant or very passionate about is adding, not just looking up dates and stuff for my ancestors. I want to tell the story, and I want to add historical things, and I don't know, just all around what's happened around them. And so what do we who don't have Jewish ancestry do to incorporate or document Jewish history in our own genealogy? What could we do?
I love
So it's
that
really going to
question.
depend where your ancestors lived and what kind of Jewish community was in the area that you're researching. In some cases, I actually I had sent a letter, a snail mail letter, about 10 years ago to the town hall in the small town in Ukraine that one branch of my family came from. And I said, hey, my family came from there. I wrote it in Ukrainian with some Google Translate help. Do you have anything on my family? And I never heard anything back, which wasn't surprising, but and then like 3, 4, 5 years later, I get an email from the town priest who introduced, I had put my email address in the letter. He says he's helping answer some of the old backlog in mail. He does research into family history. What are my surnames? He would love when next time he goes to the archives, he'll keep an eye out for information about my family too, which, which for me, who can't spend significant amount of time in Ukraine, was just incredible. And I still get random emails from him with court cases that my family was involved in. He sent something to me. He said, I think I remembered you were looking for the Tolchinskys. There was an inquest into where did Hillel Tolchinsky disappear to. and they figured it out. He went to America. They were right. That was my great-great-grandfather.
Oh.
But you know,
Wow.
he had left. Nobody, and they went through all the places they were looking for him and what everybody said. And this Jewish family wouldn't talk, but they think they didn't talk because they helped him escape. And it was so just, if you find things that can help the Jewish community, especially in Europe, where not a lot of things have been indexed, more and more is getting indexed and online. If you have information that can help people, reach out and share it with them. And, that's not just Jewish, it's anybody, but especially because a lot of the places in Eastern Europe that Jews lived in don't have a lot on Ancestry and don't have a lot on MyHeritage. Family Search does have some documents, image for some towns, but not a lot of them are indexed. And so, people don't have the time, the patience, the language skills to necessarily go through all of those like obsessive people like I have. And so, if you're going through them and you see these resources are available, reach out. Jewish Gen, which is a free website, jewishgen.org, they have something you can register for called the Jewish Genealogical Family Finder, or JGFF. And people can register saying, I am researching the Rutner family from Kolodna. And so you can look and see who is researching Jewish families from the towns that you're interested in and reach out to them and say, hey, I have this information. Would this be helpful? And just like anywhere else, you're going to have the people who put a name up there 20 years ago and don't care anymore, but you're going to have the people who really do care and really could be thankful.
Wow. That's an amazing resource.
It's
let me
great in both
question-
directions.
And I've heard of people that had no idea that they had Jewish ancestry and they do a DNA test. And
Yes.
all of a sudden, because of what you were talking about, people would change their names, they would change their religion, they would hide it.
Yeah.
We've seen episodes of Genealogy TV. Oh, Dan, do you have that in your family?
Yeah, I took a DNA test and it came back that I was 6% Jewish, which was a surprise. And because that was high and outside of like, they just made a mistake. And didn't really know. I sort of kind of knew where it fit in. And then this December, when I was at the Family History Library doing some research while I was there for the Christmas tour, found in a Catholic church record the parents of one of my great-great-grandmother, and next to her mother's name was the word Juden.
Wow.
So they listed her, but specifically said that she was Jewish, but her children, all of her children were baptized as Catholics. Because it was far easier in the Austria-Hungarian Empire to be Catholic than it was to be Jewish.
Wow.
What part of Austria-Hungary was that in?
It was in just outside of Subotica,
Okay.
which had a very large Jewish population,
Yeah.
and no longer does.
The story of Eastern Europe.
Right. And so, but yeah, that's my story. So now that I found her, the unfortunately the synagogue records for that town, as far as I can tell, are not in existence. Any tips on where to go?
Have you looked on Jewish Gen and the Hungarian special interest group?
I have, yeah.
So I'd have to look for that specifically, but I can get you in touch with somebody named Vivian who really knows that area very well and can kind of tell you what, so in some places there really are no records. Right. And that might be the case here. But one of the myths of Jewish genealogy is that all the records were destroyed. So in most cases, you can find something, and in many cases, you can find a lot.
Cool.
Huh. That's good to know, because I've heard that too, is that somebody, the records were just destroyed.
Most of the records, a lot of people think the Nazis destroyed the Jewish
Yeah.
records. The Nazis actually were trying to maintain the Jewish records because they were using it to trace who was Jewish.
Gotcha.
And so because of that, the records the records actually survived. The records that were destroyed tended to be destroyed by mistake, bomb drops on building kind of thing. But they, it wasn't a targeted Jewish records destruction type thing. It was more preservation of those records. And so in many cases, you can reconstruct large, but you can reconstruct families back to when surnames begin. In Eastern Europe, it tended to be late 1700s, early 1800s, depending on exactly where people lived. Western Europe, it tended to be a little bit earlier.
So how did it work when there wasn't surnames? What was the
Abraham,
system?
son of Jacob.
Oh, okay.
Which means that you can trace them back to surnames. and you might be able to find an earlier census, but how do you know which one's your Abraham, son of Jacob? There could be 10 of them in the town. So there are methodologies that you can sometimes use to trace back a little bit that way, but sometimes you just get stuck because what I found both from doing research as well as doing a ton of indexing, a lot of these people weren't very creative in names. And
My
so,
family.
I know,
yeah.
like all of our families, right?
exactly. But even like these whole towns. And so if you look, like right now I'm doing a lot of indexing of Hungarian records, and the birth records say the girls, if you get Sarah, Rivka, which is Rebecca, Rachel, which is Rachel, Leah, Chaya, and Hannah, that's probably 90% of your girls in the town,
Oh, wow.
right? And you have the same thing with boys' names. So,
Yeah.
you know, once you get to the A son of B or C daughter of D, you know, unless it's, you know, the one family that decided to be unique, and you hope you have those, but general, my family was boring,
Oh,
you know,
gosh.
it gets more difficult to push past that, you know, no surname time.
Huh.
Well, to piggyback on Melissa's question, when it comes to Holocaust Remembrance Day every year, what can people, those of us that haven't lost any family members that at least we know of in the Holocaust, how can we be helpful? How can we help the world remember what happened and
So
highlight?
use your social media. A lot of the different Holocaust museums, like the one in DC and Yad Vashem in Israel, they'll let you kind of adopt the memory of somebody, so you can share this person and say, you know, here's a picture of this 4-year-old who grew up in Warsaw. These were her parents, these are her siblings. And so you can share, and it makes it more human because, you know, you kind of, like we're seeing now with COVID, once we're getting to these numbers, it's just like, you can't even, like, you know, 1 million people, 100,000 people, it's beyond the
exactly
comprehension. So when you make it personal, you know, that's what makes the difference. So, you know, share a particular victim's story and say, this was a real person. And here's them before the war where they just look like a normal kid or a normal adult. And this is what happened to them. And sometimes it's, you know, it's like, this is a picture that was taken 4 months before she was killed. And it's like, you know, it just looks like you know, sometimes it's a teenager and it just looks like a teenager who's having fun. And, you know, it makes it more human. It makes it more accessible. I mean, I grew up with this. I had, my father's parents were Holocaust survivors. So going there for the weekend, I would come home and have nightmares. My parents never realized it was because my bedtime stories were, you know, the time my grandmother was in the barn with her sister and the Nazis put bayonets in the hay. And, you know, I grew up with these stories.
Oh, my goodness.
But, oh yeah. So it's amazing I'm not as messed up as I could be.
Yeah, it's
But,
funny
you
that
know,
you mentioned that about the museums, and I do a webinar about museums have records too. And one of the things that I include is a photograph of Anne Frank's diary from the Holocaust Center for Humanity. And so, you know, I'm hoping in that way that because I talk about all the different kinds of museums that are archives. That's kind of my gist of that presentation. And so and I talk about ethnic archives or ethnic museums. And so I include that to hopefully, like Laura was saying, you know, for me to be able to educate others about, you know, those that's there, and that it's important for us to not only remember, but for us to get out there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but thank you. I'd never heard of being able to adopt.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the right word, but it's kind of like.
I know what you mean, but to be able to highlight a person, you know,
Right.
in their honor, that's really cool.
That is cool.
I did see this week that a Holocaust survivor in Belgium, he actually died from COVID-19.
There's been a bunch, yeah.
Yes, so there's so few left.
Yes, there are, and unfortunately they're now older, and so they're in the demographic that's being affected. But yeah, there was something in the local Jewish newspaper, I think last weekend, which had a page with just pictures of Holocaust survivors who have died of COVID.
No, really?
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of tying together Holocaust Memorial Day and this, and so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, Yeah,
The stories that you were talking about that your grandparents were telling you, I'm sure you've captured those.
I have.
Yeah.
My grandfather seldom spoke about anything. My grandmother seldom didn't speak about it. Um, Steven Spielberg started the Shoah Foundation, where he was videotaping Holocaust survivors. My grandmother at the time set the record for the number of VHS tapes that her interview took up.
Wow.
I believe it was 15
Oh,
VHS
wow.
tapes.
Wow.
And I got them all on DVD, and I transcribed them, which took
Wow.
a lot of time. But you can,
Sure.
yeah. So we have all of her stories on there, plus the ones I had heard in person. But she had a photographic memory, and so she pretty much gave
Oh.
every detail, to the point the interviewer was like, "Okay, let's move on. What happened next?" She says, "The next day it rained."
Oh, I love it.
And what did you do on that day? We we hid in the forest.
Oh.
Okay, and then what happened the next day? There was a little bit of sun. It was like, this poor woman who was interviewing her was like, okay, but what happened besides the weather? We were hiding. Okay. So
I love it, but it shows her character. That's wonderful.
completely.
And what
we-
a treasure that you
Yes.
get to see your grandmother. I mean, what I
Yes.
wouldn't
Yeah.
give
Oh,
to be
yes.
able to see my grandmother again.
Yeah.
Yes, we
Oh,
did that.
absolutely.
And my other grandparents, because I started this so young, I interviewed them probably in the mid 90s. And so I recently digitized that and sent it
Mm.
out to everybody too.
Oh, that's great. That's great. You know, I did a lot of interviewing too, but
Mhm.
now I wish that I'd gone back and redone it, you know, because now I
You
know
have other
more what
questions.
yeah, I've got other
Mhm.
questions and I
Yeah.
know, oh, why didn't I ask this? Because I
Mhm.
was young and I didn't know I should ask that question.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yep.
so
Yep.
ask everything.
Sure. For sure. But it's kind of funny. It's fun to watch. Like we were asking my grandparents, did you know your grandparents growing up? And my grandfather said, yes, my grandparents lived down the street from me. I said, oh, what were their names? Because at that point, I guess I hadn't figured out their names. And he said, Bubby and Zadie Tolchin and Bubby and Zadie Supkoff. And I said,
Oh,
okay, but what were their
well,
first names?
yeah.
And he looks and he gets this look. He says, I guess those weren't their real names. He had never thought about it.
Oh, that's cute.
And so,
That's so cute.
but I have that on video.
Oh, that's wonderful. Lara, if somebody was just starting out their journey and they, you know, are going down that path looking for their Jewish ancestors, are there places you would send them? These are if you're going to do exhaustive research, these are the places you need to go to look for
So
records.
it
Does it
really
just
depends
depend?
where their families came from,
Okay.
right? So the first and most important thing is figuring out where in Europe they were from.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people just know Russia.
Yes.
The Russian Empire was enormous.
Yes.
Jews were constrained to live in a part that was called the Pale of Settlement,
Mm-hmm.
which is pretty much Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine, some of Moldova,
Yes.
Latvia, Lithuania, right? So most Jews, a few did, but the majority of Jews didn't live in modern day Russia at all.
Mm.
And so people really need to figure out where they lived, and then figure out the exact town or village,
Mhm.
because the majority of these records haven't been indexed. And so if you're looking in the big city nearby, you're not going to find them. If you're looking in the next village over, you're not going to find them.
Hmm.
So, doing that research and carefully tracing back generation by generation, that's the best way. And Jewish Gen is very helpful. There's tutorials kind of getting started on Jewish Gen. But once people came to the US, you want to use the traditional resources like Ancestry, Family Search to kind of trace people back. But there's also other resources. A lot of Jewish newspapers have been digitized now and are online and searchable. Some of them haven't, but usually the
Mhm.
local museum or Jewish Museum or Historical Society will have them. And those because they're, much smaller and geared towards the immigrant community, they tend to have a lot more information. They'll often mention where the people are from.
Mm.
They'll give you the kind of cool stories about the people that you wouldn't get otherwise, and that really wouldn't merit being in the larger city news,
Mhm.
but will merit being in these smaller, more chit-chatty type of
Mhm.
newspapers. And Jewish museums also have tons of other information. The one in Maryland, for example, in Baltimore, one of the rabbis kept copies of all the marriage licenses for all the marriages that he conducted. And
Wow.
he made his own notes on the sides of some of them.
Oh.
So yeah, so Maryland is I call it a genealogically stupid state because it does not require parents' names on the marriage ever, like all the way back, even now. I hate it. It's awful. But this wonderful rabbi would sometimes make notes of who the parents were.
Oh.
And so you'll sometimes get those. They also have records from some of the moalim. A moal is the person does the bris, the circumcision ceremony, and some of the moals kept records of all the boys and their names and their parents, and sometimes who the godfather was, who usually was a close friend or relative. And so, they have all kinds of gems of information. Sometimes they don't even know what they have. I kind of sweet talked my way down to the basement and was like, can I see what's in that box? And I found records from the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society that helped my grandparents come to America in 1947. They had folders on my grandparents and my great-grandmother with copies of the telegrams back and forth of trying to get them visas. And we think we got them on a ship and we didn't get them on this ship. We got on this other ship. Oh no, the ship sunk. They're dead. Wait, it made it to England. We're putting them on a separate ship. All of this back and forth. And then once they got to America, because Highest had sponsored them, they had to send periodic reports in to like the Department of State saying, yep, this is what they're doing. This is how much English they've learned. This is how they're supporting themselves, all in a box in the basement of the Jewish Museum. So the local Jewish museums, Jewish historical societies can be a treasure trove of information.
Wow.
But most of it is not online.
Right. And it probably never will be online.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just
You agree? You agree, Lara?
I'm agreeing. It's sad. Yeah. But there's just so much, and most of them are so short-staffed, and yeah.
So I have a question about Jewish grave markers.
Oh yeah.
In Irish, I do a lot of Irish research, and they often would say a native of the county or a village where they came from. Is that typical in Jewish grave markers?
Sometimes, but it's not something you'd count on. What Jewish grave markers do have is they'll have the name of the deceased in Hebrew and the name of their father. So that gives you a generation back, but it also gives you the people's Hebrew names. So if you know your great-grandfather Isidore came to America, he didn't immigrate as Isidore, most probably. And so by finding his grave marker, you might find out he was Yitzchak or Yisachar, and then you can use that name to actually find the manifest of him coming over, which might say his town. Okay. So grave markers are incredibly useful. They're generally in Hebrew. You often have the English name, but the Hebrew name, the father's name will be in Hebrew, but you could post it on Jewish Facebook groups like Tracing the Tribe or Jewish Genealogy Portal, and those get translated like this. Like I'll start translating and all of a sudden I see, oh, somebody else just did it. So, and sometimes you have these long like poems that, all talk about how wonderful the person was, but sometimes you can gain more insight. Some of them are kind of like everybody was generous, everybody was smart, everybody was whatever. But sometimes you kind of have the extra thing where you're like, okay, this was somebody about the person rather than just everyone loved them.
Yeah. Wow. Those are amazing. I know that I've seen some of those headstones and they're just amazing. They're just absolutely amazing. And I don't know, some of the communities will have separate cemeteries. They'll have separate, Jewish cemeteries, African American cemeteries, those types of things. And so, I've walked through a couple of those and they're just amazing. You can get so much information from that. Yeah. And they're beautiful. Those headstones are beautiful too.
Yeah, they
usually there's depending on what the carvings are, a lot of them mean things. Right. And so you can get insight into the person based on what the tombstone looks like. Like if it looks like a tree stump, then that's generally a young person because their life was cut off short. And and you'll have different inscriptions. You'll have something that looks like a pitcher of water, and that generally means the person was a Levite because they were responsible for washing the feet of the priests in the Holy Temple. And so, sometimes it doesn't mean anything, you'll see like a heart or something, but oftentimes the different, the shape of the tombstone or the kind of etchings on it might give you additional insight about the person.
Wow, that's amazing.
That's cool.
That is really cool.
I have a question about, cousin intermarriage, I don't know if that's a typical thing. I did a bunch of Jewish research because I thought my brother's grandfather was this Jewish doctor from San Francisco till Dick did a DNA test. He's got 0 Jewish DNA. But I had researched this whole Hartman family that I thought belonged to
Yeah.
my and I thought George Hartman was the father, and his mom was Fanny Krotozinner, and George's sister Jenny married a Dr. Martin Krotozinner. So I didn't know if that was a potential clue that was a relationship.
It not for sure, but it often was. Usually in Europe, within small villages, you kind of were marrying cousins because that's what you had to choose from. But even once people emigrated, they kind of hung out with the people from their town. And so you were kind of a known quantity, a known entity, a known quantity. And so you,
Right.
yeah, so that
The
was
Hartman
not,
family had gone to San Francisco, and then this Martin Krotozinner came to join them, I guess. And so I didn't know if it was kind of an arranged thing, maybe.
it could have been. That often happened. One of my great grandfathers came to America. He made money. He went back to marry somebody from his village and brought her back to America. And so there was a lot of that, right? You came to America, you have people who spoke a slightly different Yiddish dialect, or they only spoke English. So you wanted somebody you could communicate with who understood you. So who better than a family member or somebody from your village who might happen to be a family member?
Makes perfect
But
sense.
yeah, it was not uncommon. I have parts of my tree that kind of look like this.
Looks
I
like
have-
a vine?
Yeah, pretty much. I haven't, it looks like a double helix in some places. I have an uncle who married his niece, and this was in the 20th century.
Oh wow.
Lots of first cousin, second cousin, third cousin marriages. I'm my own cousin in several different ways. So, yeah.
And that it really mirrors Southern research.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that in Southern research, but along those lines, I'm remembering either a Who Do You Think You Are or a Finding Your Roots episode where they found Jewish ancestors living in, I want to say like Georgia in the South.
Uh-huh.
And they talked about how unusual that was.
So it's not completely unusual. So the majority of Jews who live in America today came in between like the 1890s and 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
But there were Jews who came early on. There were Jews who fought in the Revolutionary War. My sister-in-law ends up having a direct ancestor who came to South Carolina in the 1790s. And I was in Charleston a couple months ago and went to the cemetery where my niece's ancestors are buried. So it's not unheard of. It's just more rare than, most people, most Jews who can't trace their family back in America that long. I was at a conference, I was at Jamboree a couple years ago, and the Daughters of the American Revolution were there, and I passed by their booth and needed a Reese's peanut butter cup, and the lady started talking to me, and I said, I'm sorry, I really don't qualify. And she says, well, honey, just keep researching. And I was like, no. So I had no ancestors in America before 1906. She looks at me and she says, keep tracing back. I'm like, no, you don't understand. She did not understand. I'm like, totally 20th century. And so that's the majority of Jews are that, but you did have mostly Jews of Sephardic, which is originally from Spain, but who were exiled in 1492. A lot of them came to the West Indies because they went from there. They went to Amsterdam. Some came to the West Indies or the Caribbean, and they ended up in the southeast of the United States. So, and when you had the slave rebellions, like in Haiti and places like that, a lot of them came to what's now the U.S. So it happened. It's just less common than family stories like mine.
Well, that's amazing. Does anybody have any? Laura, we are so happy that you're here. I've learned a lot. I love it when we have people on that their niche, what they're researching is so different, something that I've not done before, because I always learn something. And I always learn different ways I can do my own research from other people when they're talking as well. So I love it. And I know people will, go to conferences and say, well, I don't want to take this class, or I don't want to take this class because I don't have any of that. But no, take it.
I always
You'll
go to
learn.
the, yeah.
Yeah, you learn so much, and you learn methodologies that will help you, and ideas will pop into your head, because I've had ideas pop into my head, about different things that you can do. So I appreciate so much you being here. Does anybody have any last minute things they would like to ask Lara before we say goodbye?
It's kind of a cheater kind of question for among genealogists, but I have several acquaintances that are interested in finding out their genealogies, but they're really not interested in doing the research. So if they wanted to pay someone to do their research, is there a good repository where you can find good recommendations for independent researchers that would help them, that specialize in Jewish genealogy and then specialize by location? Or do they
So
just go to the APG and
go to APG, but again, like anything else, you really need to make sure that the person comes with good recommendations and really understands the specific area that they're interested in. Now, if it's somebody who doesn't even know where their family came from, you're going to want somebody who can figure that out, and then maybe be comfortable enough to say, you know what, we're back in, Latvia, and I'm really not comfortable with Latvian records, kind of we'll end here. Or, be able to say, okay, Latvian records, they're digitized, they're available online, the Russian Empire, if you read Russian or Hebrew, you can read them easily. And then, so having that person who's able to either say yes or know when to pass somebody off. But that's like anywhere else that you research.
Exactly. Now, Lara, do you take private clients?
I do, but right now I am full up, and I've been turning people away because I just don't have the time. I have a full-time job in addition to all of this, and so I have to kind of make sure that anybody I take on, I will be able to give everything I need.
Exactly. Well, we are so grateful to have you come on. This has been really fun. It's been really
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
It's good to see you. I feel like
Me
it's
too.
been forever.
I know, since Roots Tech.
I know, but
I know.
Like,
yeah.
That doesn't it feel like it's been years ago?
The world has changed.
I know.
Oh, hold on. I should change my background to show you what oh, that's the wrong place. What I normally do. Recognize this?
Oh, yes.
You'll have to explain real quick before we go.
Because Lara was driving the car when I took this.
So they went out.
This is Antelopeless Island, where we went to find antelopes, and we found a lot of buffaloes, but
that was fine.
But I think the rumor about antelopes, that's just totally false.
There's no antelopes on Antelope Island.
We were calling it Antelopeless Island.
Oh my goodness. Oh, this is always so much fun. I love hanging out with my gym friends.
It's a blast.
Thank you, Lara. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me.
And we will see you next time on Gen Friends. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.